but I'll be going back and forth between whispers and soft-spoken, so I hope you enjoy. These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. For you, dearest reader. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder, which as they kiss, consume. Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Prologue. In glittering Shanghai, a monster awakens. Its eyes snap open in the belly of the Huangpu River, jaws unhinging at once to taste the foul blood seeping into the waters. Lines of red slither through this ancient city's modern streets, lines that draw webs in the cobblestones like a network of veins, and drip by drip these veins surge into the waters, pouring the city's life essence into the mouth of another. As the night grows dark, the monster pushes itself up, eventually emerging from the waves with the leisure of a forgotten god. When it turns its head up, all that it can be seen is the low-hanging, plump moon. It breathes in. It slinks closer. Its first breath transforms into a cold breeze, hurtling into the streets and brushing the ankles of those unfortunate enough to be stumbling home during the devil's hour. This place hums to the tune of debauchery. This city is filthy and deep in the thrall of unending sin, so saturated with the kiss of decadence that the sky threatens to buckle and crush all those living vivaciously beneath it in punishment. But no punishment comes. Not yet. The decade is loose, and the morals are looser, as the West throws its arms up in unending party, as the rest of the Middle Kingdom remains splintered among aging warlords and the remnants of imperial rule. Shanghai sits in its own little bubble of power, the Paris of the East, the New York of the West. Despite the toxin trickling from every dead-ended alleyway, this place is so very alive. And the monster, too, is birthed anew. Unknowingly, the people of this divided city carry on. Two men stumble out from their favorite brothel's open doors, their laughter piercing and loud. The silence of the late hour stands in sudden contrast to the roaring activity they have emerged from, and their ears struggle to adjust, ringing loudly with the transition. One is short and stout, as if he could lie on the ground and begin rolling down the sidewalk in the manner of a marble. The other is tall and gawky, his limbs drawn in right angles. With their arms swung round each other's shoulders, they stumble toward the waterfront, toward the river that runs in from the sea, where merchants arrive with commodities, day in, day out. The two men are familiar with these ports. After all, when they're not frequenting jazz clubs or downing the newest shipments of wine from some foreign country, they run messages here, guard merchants here, haul stock back and forth here, all for the Scarlet Gang. They know this boardwalk like the back of their hands, even when it's presently quiet of the usual 1,000 different languages hollered under 1,000 different flags. At this hour, there is only the muffled music from nearby bars and the large shop banners overhead ruffling with every gust of wind, and the 5 white flowers talking animatedly in Russian. It is the fault of the 2 scarlet men for not hearing the racket sooner, but their brains are clogged with alcohol, and their senses are buzzing pleasantly. By the time the white flowers are in sight, by the time the men see their rivals standing around one of the ports, passing a bottle, shoving shoulders with uproarious laughter, neither party can back away without losing face. The white flowers straighten up, heads tilting into the wind. "We should continue walking," the short scarlet man whispers to his companion. "You know what Lord Kai said about getting into another fight with the white flowers." The gawkier one only bites down on the inside of his cheeks, sucking his face in until he looks like a smug, drunk ghoul. "He said we shouldn't initiate anything. He never said we couldn't get into a fight." The scarlet men speak in the dialect of their city, their tongues laid flat and their sounds pressed tight. Even as they raise their voices with the confidence of being on their home turf, they are uneasy, because it's rare now for a white flower to not know the language. Sometimes their accents are indistinguishable from a Shanghai native. In fact, that proves correct when one of the white flowers, grinning, bellows, "Well, are you trying to pick a fight?" The taller scarlet man makes a low sound at the base of his throat and aims a wad of spit at the white flowers. It lands by the shoe of the nearest. In a blink, guns upon guns, each arm raised and steady and trigger-happy, ready to pull. This is a scene that no soul bats an eye toward any longer. This is a scene that is more commonplace in heady Shanghai than the smoke of opium wafting from a thick pipe. "Hey, hey!" A whistle blows into the terse silence. A policeman who runs on sight only expresses annoyance at the standstill before him. He's seen this exact scene 3 times already within the week. He has forced rivals into jail cells and called for cleanup when the members left one after another dead and pierced with bullets instead. Weary with the day, all he wants to do is go home and soak his feet in hot water and eat the meal his wife would have left cold on the table. His hand is already itching for his baton, itching to beat some sense into these men, itching to remind these people that they have no personal grudge against each other. All that fuels them is reckless, baseless loyalty to the Kais and the Montagovs, and that it would be their ruin. "Do we want to break this up and go home?" the policeman asks, "or do we want to come with me?" And he stops abruptly. A growl is echoing from the waters. The warning that radiates from such a sound is not a deniable sensation. It is not the sort of paranoia one feels when they think they're being followed down an abandoned junction, nor is it the sort of panic that ensues when a floorboard creaks in a house thought empty. It is solid, tangible. It almost exudes a moisture into the air, a weight pressing down on bare skin. It is a threat as obvious as a gun to the face. And yet there's a moment of inaction, a moment of hesitation. The short and stout scarlet man wavers first, his eyes darting to the edge of the boardwalk. He ducks his head, peering into the murky depths, squinting to follow the choppy, rolling motions of the water's small ripples. He's just at the right height for his companion to scream and knock him down with a brutal elbow to the temple, when something bursts from the river. Little black specks. As the short man falls to the ground and slams down hard, the world is raining down on him in dots. Strange things he cannot quite see as his vision spins and his throat gags in nausea. He can only feel pinpricks landing on him, itching his arms, his legs, his neck. He hears his companion screaming, the white flowers roaring at one another in indecipherable Russian. Then finally the policeman shrieking in English, "Get it off, get them off." The man on the ground has a thudding, thunderous heartbeat. With his forehead pressed to the boardwalk, unwilling to behold whatever is causing these terrible howls, his own pulse consumes him. It overtakes every one of his senses, and only when something thick and wet splashes against his leg does he scramble upright in horror, flailing so extremely that he kicks free a shoe and doesn't bother to fetch it. He doesn't look back as he runs. He scrubs himself free of the debris that had rained down on him, hiccuping in his desperation to breathe in. Breathe in. Breathe in. He doesn't look back to check what had been lurking in the waters. He doesn't look back to see if his companion needs help. And he certainly doesn't look back to determine what had landed on his leg with a viscous, sticky sensation. The man only runs and runs, past the neon delight of the theaters as the last of their lights wink off, past the whispers crawling under the front doors of brothels, past the sweet dreams of the merchants who sleep with piles of money underneath their mattresses. And he is long gone by the time there are only dead men lying along the ports of Shanghai, their throats torn out and their eyes staring up at the night sky, glassy with the reflection of the moon. Chapter 1. September 1926. In the heart of the Scarlet Gang territory, a burlesque club was the place to be. The The calendar was rolling closer and closer to the end of the season, the pages of each date ripping free and blowing away quicker than the browning tree leaves. Time was both hurried and unhurried at once, the days becoming scarce, yet dragging on for far too long. Workers were always hurrying somewhere. Never mind whether they truly had a destination to pursue. There was always a whistle blowing in the background. There was always the constant chugging noise of trams dragging themselves along the worn tracks grooved into the streets. There was always the stench of resentment, stinking up the neighborhoods and burrowing deep into the laundry that waved with the wind, like shop banners outside cramped apartment windows. Today was an exception. The clock had paused on the mid-autumn festival, the 22nd of the month, according to the Western methods of day-keeping this year. Once it was customary to light lanterns and whisper tales of tragedy, to worship with the ancestors revered with the moonlight cupped in their palms. Now it was a new age, one that thought itself above its ancestors. Regardless of which territory they stood upon, the people of Shanghai had been bustling about with the spirit of modern celebration since sunrise, and at present, with the bells ringing 9 times for the hour, the festivities were only getting started. Juliet Kai was surveying the club, her eyes searching for the first signs of trouble. It was dimly lit, despite the abundance of the twinkling chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The atmosphere dark and murky and wet. There was also a strange, sodden smell wafting under Juliet's nose in waves, but the poor renovations seemed not to bother the mood of those seated at various round tables scattered throughout the club. The people here would hardly take notice of a small leak in the corner when the constant activity consumed their attention instead. Couples were whispering over decks of tarot cards. Men were shaking one another with vigor. Women were inclining their heads to gasp and shriek in recollection of whatever story was being told over the flickering gaslight. "You look rather woeful." Juliet didn't immediately turn in haste to identify the voice. She didn't have to. There were very few people who would approach her speaking English to begin with, never mind English with the flat tones of a Chinese mother tongue and the accent of a French upbringing. I am perpetually filled with woe." Only then did she crane her head, her lips curling up and her eyes narrowing at her cousin. "Aren't you supposed to be on stage next?" Rosalind Lang shrugged and crossed her arms, the jade bangles on her slender brown wrists clinking together. "They cannot begin the show without me," Rosalind scoffed, "so I am not worried." Juliet scanned the crowd again, this time with a target in mind. She found Kathleen, Rosalind's fraternal twin, near a table at the back of the club. Her other cousin was patiently balancing a tray full of plates, staring at a British merchant while he tried to order a drink with exaggerated gesticulations. Rosalind was under contract here to dance. Kathleen showed up to wait tables when she got bored and took a measly wage just for the fun of it. Sighing, Juliet dug out a lighter to keep her hands occupied, releasing the flame, then quenching it to the rhythm of the music gliding around the room. She waved the small silver rectangle under her cousin's nose. "What?" Rosalind responded by pulling out a cigarette tucked within the folds of her clothing. "You don't even smoke," she said as Juliet angled the lighter down. "Why do you carry that thing around?" Straight-faced, Juliet replied, "You know me, running around, living life, committing arson." Rosalind inhaled her first puff of smoke and then rolled her eyes. "Right." A better mystery would have been where Juliet even kept the lighter. Most girls in the burlesque club, dancer or patron alike, were dressed as Rosalind was, in the fashionable kipao, sweeping through Shanghai like a wildfire, with the outrageous slit down the side, revealing ankle to thigh, and the high collar acting like a chokehold. The design was a blend of Western flamboyance with Eastern roots, and in a city of divided worlds, The women were walking metaphors. But Juliet had been transformed through and through, the little beads of her pocketless flapper dress swishing with every movement. She stood out here, that much was certain. She was a bright, burning star, a symbolic figurehead for the vitality of the Scarlet Gang. Juliet and Rosalind both quietly turned their attention to the stage, where a woman was crooning a song in a language that neither were familiar with. The singer's voice was lovely, her dress shimmering against dark skin, but this was not the sort of show that this sort of cabaret was known for, and so no one save the two girls at the back was listening. "You didn't tell me you'd be here tonight," Rosalind said after a while, smoke escaping her mouth in a quick stream. There was betrayal in her voice, like the omission of information was out of character. The Juliet who'd returned last week was not the same Juliet that her cousins had waved goodbye to 4 years ago, but the changes were mutual. Upon Juliet's return, before she'd even set foot back into the house, she'd heard talk of Rosalind's honey-coated tongue and effortless class. After 4 years away, Juliet's memories of the people she had left behind no longer aligned with who they had become. Nothing of her memory had withstood the test of time. The city had reshaped itself, and everyone in it had continued moving forward without her, especially Rosalind. It was very last minute. Over at the back of the club, the British merchant had started pantomiming to Kathleen. Juliet gestured towards the scene with her chin. Baba was getting tired of some merchant called Walter Dexter pushing for a meeting, so I'm to hear what he wants. Sounds boring, Rosalind intoned. Her cousin always had bite to her words, even when speaking with the driest intonation. A small smile perked at Juliet's lips. At the very least, even if Rosalind felt like a stranger, albeit a familiar one, she would always sound the same. Juliet could close her eyes and pretend they were children again, sniping at each other about the most offensive topics. She sniffed haughtily, feigning offense. "We can't all be Parisian-trained dancers. Tell you what, you take over my routine and I'll be the heir to the city's underground empire." A laugh burst from Juliet, short and loud in her amusement. Her cousin was different, everything was different, but Juliet was a fast learner. With a soft sigh, she pushed away from the wall she was leaning on. "All right," she said, her eyes latched on Kathleen. "Duty calls. I'll see you at home." Rosalind let her leave with a wave, dropping the cigarette to the ground and crushing it under her high-heeled shoe. Juliet really ought to have admonished her for doing so, but the floor couldn't have gotten any dirtier than its current state, so what was the point? From the moment she stepped into this place, 5 different sorts of opium had probably smeared into her soles. All she could do was push through the club as gingerly as possible, hoping the maids wouldn't damage the leather of her shoes when they scrubbed them clean later tonight. "I'll take it from here." Kathleen's chin jerked up in surprise, the jade pendant around her throat gleaming under the light. Rosalind used to tell her that someone was going to snatch such a precious stone if she wore it so obviously, but Kathleen liked it there. If people were to stare at her throat, she always said she would rather it be because of the pendant than the bump of her Adam's apple underneath. Her startled expression quickly turned into a smile, realizing that it was Juliet sliding into the seat opposite the British merchant. "Let me know if I can get anything for you," Kathleen said sweetly, in perfect French accented English. As she walked away, Walter Dexter's jaw dropped slack. She could understand me this whole time? "You'll learn, Mr. Dexter," Juliet began, swiping the candle from the center of the table and taking a sniff of the scented wax. "That when you assume someone cannot speak English right off the bat, they tend to make fun of you." Walter blinked at her, then cocked his head. He took in her dress, her American accent, and her knowledge of his name. "Juliet Kai," he concluded. "I was expecting your father." The Scarlet Gang called itself a family business, but it did not stop there. The Kais were the pulsing heart, but the gang itself was a network of gangsters and smugglers and merchants and middlemen of all sorts. Each and every single one of them answers to Lord Kai. Less enthused foreigners would call the Scarlets a secret society. father has no time for merchants with no credible history, Juliet replied. If it's important, I will pass along the message. Unfortunately, it appeared that Walter Dexter was far more interested in small talk than actual business. Last I heard, you'd moved to become a New Yorker. Juliet dropped the candle back onto the table. The flame flickered, casting eerie shadows over the middle-aged merchant. The lighting only deepened the wrinkles in his perpetually scrunched forehead. I was only sent to the West for education, regrettably, Juliet said, leaning back into the curved couch seat. Now I'm old enough to start contributing to the family business and whatnot, so they dragged me back, kicking and screaming. The merchant didn't laugh along to her joke, as Juliet had intended. Instead, he tapped his temple, ruffling his silver-patched hair. Hadn't you also returned for a brief period of time a few years ago? Juliet stiffened, her grin faltering. Behind her, a table of patrons erupted with uproarious laughter, collapsing in mirth over some comment made among themselves. The sound prickled at her skin, at her neck, sweeping a hot sweat over her skin. She waited for the noise to die down, using the interruption to think fast and scramble hard. Just once, Juliet replied carefully. New York City wasn't too safe during the Great War. My family was worried. The merchant still didn't drop the subject. He made a noise of consideration. The war ended 8 years ago. You were here a mere 4 previous. Juliet's smile dropped entirely. She pushed her bobbed hair back. Mr. Dexter, are we here to discuss your extensive knowledge of my personal life, or did this meeting actually have a purpose? Walter blanched. I apologize, Miss Kai. My son, he's your age, so I happen to know. He cut himself off upon noting Juliet's glare. He cleared his throat. I requested to meet with your father regarding a new product. Immediately, despite the vague word choice, it was quite clear what Walter Dexter was referring to. The Scarlet Gang was, first and foremost, a network of gangsters, and there was seldom a time when gangsters weren't heavily involved with the black market. If the Scarlets dominated Shanghai, it was hardly surprising that they dominated the black market too, decided the comings and goings, decided the men who were allowed to thrive, and the men who needed to drop dead. In the parts of the city that still belonged to the Chinese, the Scarlet Gang was not simply above the law. They were the law. Without the gangsters, the merchants were unprotected. Without the merchants, the gangsters would have little purpose or work. It was an ideal partnership, and one being threatened continually by the growing power of the White Flowers, the one other gang in Shanghai that actually had a chance at defeating the Scarlets in black market monopoly. After all, they'd been working at it for generations. The product, Juliet repeated. Her eyes swiveled up absently. The performers had switched, the spotlight dimming as the first opening notes from a saxophone played. Adorned in a brilliant new costume, Rosalind sashayed into view. Remember what happened the last time the British wanted to introduce a new product into Shanghai? Walter frowned. Are you referring to the Opium Wars? Juliet examined her fingernails. Am I? You cannot possibly blame me for something that was the fault of my country. Oh, that's not how it works? It was Walter's turn to look unimpressed. He folded his hands together as skirts swished and skin flashed on the stage behind him. Nevertheless, I require the help of the Scarlet Gang. I have bulk amounts of Lernicrum to be rid of, and it is certain to be the next most desired opiate on the market. Walter cleared his throat. I believe you're seeking an upper hand right now. Juliet leaned forward. In that sudden motion, the beads on her dress clinked together frantically, clashing with the jazz in the background. And do you really think you can give us an upper hand? The constant grappling between the Scarlet Gang and the White Flowers wasn't a secret. Far from it, in fact, because the blood feud was not something that raged only between those with Kai and Montague to their name. It was a cause that ordinary members loyal to either faction took on personally, with a fervor that could almost be supernatural. Foreigners arriving in Shanghai to do business for the first time received one warning before learning of anything else. Pick a side and pick it fast. If they traded once with the Scarlet Gang, they were scarlet through and through. They would be embraced in Scarlet territory and killed if they wandered into areas where the White Flowers reigned. I think, Walter said softly, "that the Scarlet Gang is losing control of its own city." Juliet sat back. Underneath the table, her fists tightened until the blood over her knuckles became bloodless. 4 years ago, she had looked at Shanghai with glitter in her eyes, blinking at the Scarlet Gang with hope. She hadn't understood that Shanghai was a foreign city in its own country. Now she did. The British ruled a chunk. The French ruled a chunk. The Russian white flowers were taking over the only parts that technically remained under Chinese governance. The loss of control was a long time coming, but Juliet would rather bite off her own tongue than admit it freely to a merchant who understood nothing. "We will get back to you regarding your product, Mr. Dexter," she said after a long moment, flashing an easy smile. She let out an exhale, imperceptibly, releasing the tension that had tightened on her stomach to the point of pain. "Now, if you'll excuse me." The entire club fell into a hush, and suddenly Juliet was speaking too loudly. Walter's eyes bugged, latching onto a sight over Juliet's shoulders. "I'll be," he remarked, "if it isn't one of the bullshies." At the merchant's words, Juliet felt herself go ice cold. Slowly, ever so slowly, she turned around to see Walter Dexter's line of sight, searching through the smoke and shadows, dancing at the entryway of the burlesque club. "Please don't let it be," she pleaded. "Anyone but—" Her vision turned hazy. For a terrifying second, the world was tilting on its axis, and Juliet was barely clinging to its edge. Moments away from taking a tumble, then the floor righted itself, and Juliet could breathe again. She stood and cleared her throat, concentrating all her might on sounding as bored as possible when she stated that Montagovs emigrated far before the Bolshevik Revolution, Mr. Dexter. Before anybody could take notice of her, Juliet slinked into the shadows where the dark walls dimmed the sparkling of her dress, and the soggy floorboards muffled the clicking of her heels. Her precautions were unnecessary. Everyone's gaze was firmly latched on Rama Montagov as he wound his way through the club. For once, Rosalind was carrying out a performance that not a soul was paying attention to. At first glance, it could have seemed the shock emanating from the round tables was because a foreigner had walked in. But this club had many foreigners scattered around the crowd, and Rama, with his dark hair, dark eyes, and pale skin, could have blended in among the Chinese as naturally as a white rose painted red among poppies. It wasn't because Rama Montagov was a foreigner. It was because the air of the white flowers was wholly recognizable as an enemy on Scarlet Gang territory. From the corner of her eye, Juliet was already catching sight of movement. Guns pulled from pockets, and knives pointed outward, bodies stirring with animosity. Juliet stepped out of the shadows and lifted a hand to the closest table. The motion was simple. Wait. The gangsters stilled, each group watching those nearby an example. They waited, pretending to go on with their conversations, while Rama Montagov passed table after table, his eyes narrowed in concentration. Juliet started to creep closer. She pressed a hand to her throat and forced the lump there down, forced her breath to become even until she wasn't on the verge of panic, until she could wipe on a dazzling smile. Once, Rama would have been able to see right through her, but 4 years had gone by. He had changed, and so had she. Juliet reached down and touched the back of his suit jacket. "Hello, stranger." Rama turned around. For a moment it seemed as if he hadn't registered the sight before him. He stared, his gaze as blank as clear glass, utterly uncomprehending. Then, the sight of the scarlet heiress washed over him like a bucket of ice. Rama's lips parted with a small puff of air. The last time he'd seen her, they'd been 15. "Juliet," he exclaimed automatically. But they were no longer familiar enough to use each other's first names. They hadn't been for a long while. Rama cleared his throat. "Miss Kai, when did you return to Shanghai?" "I never left," Juliet wanted to say. But that wasn't true. Her mind had remained here. Her thoughts had constantly revolved around the chaos and the injustice and the burning fury that broiled in these streets. But her physical body had been shipped across the ocean a second time for safekeeping. She hated it, hated being away so intensely that she felt the force of it burn into a fever each night when she left the parties and speakeasies. The weight of Shanghai was a steel crown nailed to her head. Another world. If she had been given a choice, perhaps she would have walked away, rejected herself as the heir to an empire of mobsters and merchants. But she never had a choice. This was her life. This was her city. These were her people. And because she loved them, she had sworn to herself a long time ago that she would do a damn good job of being who she was, because she could be no one else. "It's all your fault," she wanted to say. "You're the reason I was forced away from my city, my people, my blood." I returned a while ago. Juliet lied easily, checking her hip against the vacant table to her left. "Mr. Montague, you'll have to forgive me for asking, but what are you doing here?" She watched Roma move his hand ever so slightly and guessed he was checking for the presence of his hidden weapons. She watched him take her in, slow to form words. Juliet had time to brace herself. 7 days and 7 nights to enter the city and scrub her mind free of everything that had ever happened here between them. But whatever Roma had expected to find in this club when he walked in tonight, it certainly hadn't been Juliet. "I need to speak to Lord Kai." Roma finally said, placing his hands behind his back. "It's important." Juliet took a step closer. Her fingers had happened upon the lighter from within the folds of her dress, again thumbing the spark wheel while she hummed and thought. Roma said Kai like a foreign merchant, his mouth pulled wide. The Chinese and Russians shared the same sound for Kai. Tsai. Okay, I'm gonna say Tsai from now on. Like the sound of a match being struck. His butchering was intentional, an observation of the situation. She was fluent in Russian, he was fluent in Shanghai's unique dialect, and yet there they were, both speaking English with different accents like a couple of casual merchants. Switching to either of their native tongues would have been like taking a side, so they settled for a middle ground. "I imagine it must be important if you've come all the way here," Juliet shrugged, letting go of the lighter. "Speak to me instead, and I'll pass along the message. One heir to another, Mr. Montague. You can trust me, can't you?" It was a laughable question. Her words were one thing, but her cold, flat stare said another. "One misstep while you're in my territory, and I'll kill you with my bare hands." She was the last person he would trust, and the same went the other way. But whatever it was that Roma needed, it must have been serious. He didn't argue. "Can we?" He gestured to the side, into the shadows and the dim corners, where there would be less of an audience turning toward them, like a second show, waiting for the moment Juliet walked away so they could pounce. Thinning her lips, Juliet pivoted and waved him along to the back of the club instead. He was fast to follow, his measured steps coming closely enough that the beads of Juliet's dress clinked angrily in the disturbance. She didn't know why she was bothering. She should have thrown him to the Scarlets, let them deal with him. No, she decided. He is mine to deal with. He is mine to destroy. Juliet stopped. Now it was just her and Roma Montague in the shadows. Other sounds muffled, with other sights dimmed. She rubbed her wrist, demanding her pulse slow down, as if that were in her control. "Jump to it then," she said. Roma looked around. He ducked his head before speaking, lowering his voice until Juliet had to strain to hear him. And indeed she strained. She refused to lean any closer to him than she had to. Last night, 5 white flowers died at the ports. Their throats had been torn out. Juliet blinked at him, and she didn't mean to be callous, but members of both their gangs killed each other on the weekly. Juliet herself had already added to the death toll. If he was going to put the blame on her Scarlets, then he was wasting his time. "And," Roma said tightly, clearly biting back, "if you would let me finish, one of yours, as well as the municipal police officer. British." Now Juliet frowned a little, trying to recall if she had overheard anyone in the household last night muttering about a Scarlet death. It was strange for both gangs to have victims on the scene, given that larger killings usually happened in ambushes, and stranger still for a police officer to have been pulled down too. But she wouldn't go so far to say it was bizarre. She only raised an eyebrow at Rama, disinterested. Until continuing onward, he said, all their wounds were self-inflicted. This wasn't a territory dispute. Juliet shook her head repeatedly to one side, making sure she hadn't misheard him. When she was certain there was nothing jammed in her ear, she exclaimed, 7 dead bodies with self-inflicted wounds? Rama nodded. He placed another look over his shoulder, as if merely keeping an eye on the gangsters around the tables would prevent them from attacking him. Or perhaps he didn't care to keep an eye at all. Maybe he was trying to avoid looking straight ahead at Juliet. I'm here to find an explanation. Does your father know anything of this? Juliet scoffed, the noise deep and resentful. Didn't he mean to tell her that 5 white flowers, 1 scarlet, and a police officer had met up at the ports, then torn out their own throats? It sounded like the setup of a terrible joke without a punchline. We cannot help you, Juliet stated. Any information would be crucial to discovering what happened, Miss Tsai. Roma persisted. A little notch between his eyebrows always appeared like a crescent moon whenever he was irritated. It was present now. There was more to these deaths than he was letting on. He wouldn't get this worked up for an ordinary ambush. One of the dead was yours. We're not going to cooperate with the white flowers, Juliet cut in. Any false humor on her face had long disappeared. Let me make that clear before we proceed. Regardless of whether my father knows anything about last night's deaths, we will not be sharing it with you. We will not be furthering any contact that could endanger our own business endeavors. Now, good day, sir. Ram had clearly been dismissed, yet he remained where he stood, glaring at Juliet like there was a sour taste in his mouth. She had already turned on her heel, preparing to make her exit, when she heard Rama whisper viciously, "What happened to you?" She could have said anything in response. She could have chosen her words with the deathly venom she acquired in her years away and spat it all out. She could have reminded him of what he did 4 years ago, pushing the blade of guilt in until he was bleeding. Before she could open her mouth, a scream was piercing through the club, interrupting every other noise as if it operated on another frequency. The dancers on stage froze. The music was brought to a halt. "What's going on?" Juliet muttered. Just as she moved to investigate, Rama hissed out sharply and caught her elbow. "Juliet, don't." His touch seared through her skin like a painful burn. Juliet jerked her arm away faster than if she had already been set alight, her eyes blazing. He didn't have the right. He had lost the right to pretend he'd ever wanted to protect her. Juliet marched toward the other end of the club, ignoring Rama as he followed after her. Roma, as he followed after her. Bumbles of panic grew louder and louder, though she couldn't comprehend what was inciting such a reaction until she nudged aside the gathering crowd with an assertive push. Then she saw the man thrashing on the ground, his own fingers clawing at his thick neck. "What is he doing?" Juliet shrieked, lunging forward. "Somebody stop him." But most of his nails were already buried deep into muscle. The man was digging with an animal-like intensity, as if there was something there, something no one else could see crawling under his skin. Deeper, 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 until his fingers were wholly buried and he was pulling free tendons and veins and arteries. In the next second, the club had fallen silent completely. Nothing audible save the labored breathing of the short and stout man who had collapsed on the floor, his throat torn into pieces and his hands dripping with blood. So that's all I'm going to read for tonight. That was the prologue and chapter 1 of These Violent Delights. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this book. I'll try to get chapters 2 and 3 out as soon as possible. Thank you for listening so far, and I will read to you in the next video.